Hello and welcome to the December 8th, 2021 Committee of the Whole. I'd like to acknowledge that we are meeting today on the traditional territory of the Syilx Nation, and I'd like to call this meeting to order at 3 o'clock. Do we have any declarations of conflict today? No. Perfect. So I'd like a motion to move adoption of the agenda, which is amended. Perfect. Move seconded. All in favor? Great. No appointments and delegations, no new business. So moving on to business items. 5.1, short-term rental recommendation review. And I believe we'll start with our Director of Planning.
Indeed. Thank you, Chair McLean. Okay. How about now? Oh. Can you hear me? Okay. Excellent. So thank you for today's Committee of the Whole. So as a quick summary, the request to add regulations or increase regulations for short-term rentals was added to the budget before it was approved earlier this year in the spring, and then immediately became a priority within our work plan. And so we spent June and July preparing a scope of work, publishing a request for proposal for consultant services, and in August we selected Ecoplan International to assist us in this regard. Ecoplan has a number of comparable projects, recently working on zoning in the Powell River area, also recently assisting the town of Gibsons in a similar review of short-term rentals, and it was a good fit for us. So from September to November, we met regularly with Ecoplan to examine background issues, consultation we did last year during the zoning bylaw, and they prepared a background report. The background report is attached to the brief cover report on today's agenda for review. And so what it does is it provides an overview of the current situation in Syilx and provides for specific analysis for this community. And so many of us here understand that the community, both operators of facilities as well as neighbors, are looking to council to provide some clarity, some regulations. And so we are here today to take that next step. And so from Ecoplan, I would like to introduce both Odette Pino and Catherine Levitt, who are here. They will walk you through some of the background on some of the issues, as well as use this Mentimeter polling system to get an aggregate response from council, how you feel on issues. I'll let them describe it a little bit further. But the intent is to get some direction for us, both as staff and for folks from Ecoplan, to take the next step and start to provide draft regulations. And we anticipate that we can potentially come back at the next Committee of the Whole at the end of this month, prior to the break, with a scope of how we might move forward with regulations. So depending on the outcome of today. So they'll have a presentation for you, the Mentimeter, as well as an opportunity for discussion. So at this time, I'd like to pass it over to Odette and Catherine. They'll share their screen and run you through some information. Thank you.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Chair McLean, Mayor Seegers, and members of council. It's a pleasure to be here with you this afternoon and with my colleague, Catherine, who will be on the controls of managing the presentation slides and then also of taking us through the Mentimeter polling. The topic of short-term rentals is a really complex one, and it asks for thoughtful consideration of benefits and trade-offs and desired outcomes of what is best for the community. And so the purpose of the workshop today, I'll describe a little bit, maybe next slide, Catherine. I'd like to give a bit of an overview of the presentation, the way we have it organized today to best use this time. And the purpose is to support council in directing priorities for regulations and management tools that are best suited to your community. And the key issues and options report that was attached, I'll be pulling out some of the facts from that report, presenting it through this workshop, and then walking through 6 topic areas, providing background information on them, usually in 2 or 3 slides, And then I'll pause, and Catherine will be doing the Mentimeter polling and asking council members to rank priorities on a question related to the information that's presented, to draw from your insights as well in the context of what you know best in the community priorities. So let's, as I mentioned as well, that the polling results will be shown in aggregate, and they'll be shown as we pause through each of these segments. In all cases, when I'm presenting information, it reflects information that is provided by data from Host Compliance, which is also called Granicus. It's a short-term rental compliance company, as well as the Sunshine Coast Housing Needs Assessment and Sunshine Coast Tourism. So just to give a context for what I'll be presenting. And once we walk through this sequence that I estimate will take about 50 minutes, then I'll summarize what was heard and check in with Chair McLean to see how much time is available for a facilitated discussion. So I think that that's really the context I wanted to give to how we're running this workshop today. It's really set up to be roll up the sleeves and check in and get the best guidance that we can from council. So prioritization of goals is what guides good regulation that is coherent. And housing supply is in limited supply, and there are competing demands for housing, tourist accommodations that are wanting to operate in residential zones. Housing availability, cost, and where tourism accommodation is directed and incentivized to invest is in tension with each other. And they're competing for limited supply when discussing short-term rental housing. The cohesive regulations require clear priority goals to create a regulatory framework. And today we're seeking council direction on those priority goals before advancing with recommended short-term rental regulations. And next slide, please. Today, Catherine and I will be asking council members to rate your priorities to support the development of coherent regulations. And we'll be asking for your views in a binary way, one or the other, even though we know that it is challenging. There's a lot of gray in between. But the model for this understanding of trade-offs has been developed by Third Space Planning, who developed a toolkit for Canadian municipalities, and they identified at least 7 key areas where there are trade-offs that local governments end up addressing either implicitly or explicitly. And by making the trade-offs explicit, council can more easily clarify and prioritize the regulatory goals. So trade-offs in regulating short-term rentals are on the spectrum that generally ranges from more restrictive approaches on the left to more permissive approaches on the right. And this graphic arranges 3 of the key trade-offs on the spectrum, and it shows how it ranges from restricting short-term rentals on the left to the permissive on the right. And to put this in context, the District of Sechelt currently today is operating on the more permissive side of the scale and has very light requirements for short-term rentals. But to put this in context, the District of Sechelt regulations have been in place since 2005, and a lot has changed in 16 years, especially in the last 5 years, where the online platforms since 2015, 2016 have really taken off. So this is an appropriate time to check and with council to see if the current regulations are serving the community in ways that are intended and what is desired and appropriate for the future. So I'll pass it over now to Catherine. I'll just take a moment to pause, ask if there's any questions, and then Catherine was going to go through a sample of the Mentimeter poll and do a little test. But I just wanted to pause that just to set the context here. And I see that Mayor Seegers has a question.
Yeah, Mayor Seegers.
Thank you. So you provided us with a report, right? That's part of our agenda. At what point through this presentation will we have an opportunity to ask questions about the information that's in the report?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so the report is the basis for this workshop, and there's 6 key topic areas paused by the polling, and then a discussion at the end is how this is framed. But if something comes to the surface at this moment, perhaps it is appropriate at this moment. That's why I wanted to pause.
Go ahead, Mayor Segers.
All right, so on page 13 of our agenda package, page 10 in your report, it references zoning bylaw number 25, section 307, and it says it permits home occupations. And it seems that the indication in the report is that a short-term rental is a home occupation. That's kind of how I read it, so I'm just wondering if that's what was intended in that, with that statement.
Mm-hmm. Short-term rentals are in your zoning bylaw as a separate category. And in addition, bed and breakfast is a home occupation. And in reality, bed and breakfasts are operating today like short-term rentals. They often they have separate entrances. They don't meet their hosts. They are completely self-contained. So that is the context maybe of that they are operating very similarly, but they are a different business license and a different requirement in the District of Sechelt today.
Thank you. And because of that, on page 14, right above where it says business license, it indicates that the current zoning bylaw lacks clarity, so they're pretty much permitted in every zone right now.
That's
so
right.
Because we have home occupation allowed in every zone, short-term rentals are allowed in every zone if we equate the two.
You do have some restrictions on bed and breakfasts. They're not permitted in industrial zones and a few comprehensive development zones. They are also listed in that report. There are a few restricted areas. It's a limited number.
Thank you. Did you want to address that?
Sure, thank you. And through the chair, I would just say that there are some limited restrictions, but overall, the analysis is pretty clear that we are quite permissive as it relates to other municipalities that are comparable to us.
Okay, so then on that same page, under business license, this would be for our staff, I think, it indicates that we have, $125 business license. Can we have different classes of licenses so that we charge different types of businesses different amounts?
Yes, generally speaking, a fee that is charged is meant to be commensurate to the cost to the municipality, and it's clear that certain areas, such as short-term rental, incur a larger amount of staff time to monitor, enforce, implement, and so forth. And that will be one area we'll be investigating as we move forward.
Yeah.
Okay, so are there any other questions from council before we dig into the rest of the presentation? All right, not seeing any. Back to you guys at EcoPlan.
Great, thank you. Well, we will begin using Mentimeter with a bit of a fun question, as Odette said, just to make sure that we're all comfortable with using it and that everyone has access. So you can go ahead and go to the link that you received beforehand or the QR code. However you got to Mentimeter and were able to access it, you can go back to that. And we'll all go there and watch the results together. So this is our first question. We thought we'd start off a little bit more fun. What's your favorite Sechelt animal? So you can see that as you all start voting, we'll see the results coming in. We can't see who's voting for what, so we'll just wait. We've got all 5. Looks like the heron is...
It should be 6, so we're short 1.
Thank you. Pardon me, I meant to ask just exactly how many numbers we had. Great. We've got
There we go.
all 6 here. Still the heron king in the lead. That one's always a popular local animal. So I trust that no one had any difficulties getting in there. You can keep that browser open because we'll just go back to the presentation now, but we'll go right back to that same spot to use Menti throughout the presentation. And we'll go back to Odette.
Great. Thank you. So Catherine, I just want to see the next slide of great, thank you. And so in this first section, and I'll be pausing, coming back 6 times. And in this set, I'll present 2 slides. And the purpose of this section is to summarize the scale of short-term residential rentals in the housing stock District of Sechelt context. So the poll after these 2 slides will ask council members about your priority around protection of housing supply. As of September 2021, there are 249 active unique rental listings in the District of Sechelt. And in between 2016 and 2021, this represents a 39% increase in listings. So in 2016, that number was about 179 listings, and it increased 70 units to 2021. So currently 91% of active unique listings are for entire homes, defined as self-contained dwelling units, and that's about 226. And then 9% are for the rental of partial homes. So that's 22 rooms in any type of dwelling unit. So that's more like the traditional way of saying B&B if it's a room in a dwelling unit. About 2/3 of short-term rental units, 167, are taking place in secondary suites, cottages, and accessory dwellings. So when we move on to looking at the context in housing, currently in the District of Sechelt, with the latest census available data, so 2016, so it is dated, there are 4,855 households. The vacancy rate is not known because it's too small of a sample size. And the household affordability standards, so where people are spending more than 30% of their income on shelter, is 24%. The Housing Needs Report concluded that the District of Sechelt currently has, the rental stock does not currently meet the high demand for rental housing. And residents expressed concerns about lack of housing, long-term rental housing, and the effects of short-term vacation rentals on increasing competition for secondary suites and auxiliary dwelling units. Residents are concerned that the rental market is experiencing pressures on vacancy rates and the costs of rent, even though we don't have data on that, the vacancy rates in particular. So 1,140 units are rental households in the District of Sechelt, and 167 short-term rental residential units are taking place in secondary suites and auxiliary dwelling units, which represents a significant rental housing stock in the District of Sechelt context. In December of 2020, District of Sechelt did a community survey, and residents also expressed this concern. So this next poll is going to ask council to identify their priorities in what you would like to encourage in terms of short-term rental or long-term rental housing. Over to Catherine.
Great, thanks Odette. So you can go ahead and go back to that Menti poll, and I'll bring it up. You can see it start to come in. With respect to protection of long-term rental supply, we have 2 questions here that we'll be asking. So the first is about housing availability and cost. And then the second is about availability of long-term rentals. And as Odette mentioned when we got started, we know it's quite a challenge to pick an either or option, but it is really helpful for us to get a sense of priorities just by using 2 options. So with this first one, with housing availability and cost, we've got no tolerance for housing loss, and then the other option is high tolerance for housing loss. So we've got 3 results so far. We'll wait for the final 2 to come in before we move on. But really with these questions, and as we go through all of these questions, you'll notice they are on opposite sides of the spectrum, which is really getting to that visual that Odette shared in the previous slide showing the spectrum. There's a lot of gray area in the middle, but we'd really like to get a sense of where you are on either side of that spectrum. Looks like we've just got one more. Just one final result before we move on to the second question.
Yeah, just could everyone check their phones quickly and make sure they hit submit, and it should be showing a slide that you're waiting for the presenter to show the next slide.
Thank you, Chair. Great. So with that, we'll go ahead and move on to the second question. Odette, did you want to discuss these? So looking at the availability of long-term rentals, the 2 options we have here are prioritize supporting renters or prioritizing supporting current owners. And again, there's a lot of area in between to choose there, but for the purpose of this, we'd like to get a sense of where your priorities lie on either side of the spectrum. Got 4 results so far, an even split between the 2. Great, there's just one more left. Perfect, we've got everyone in, and I see we've got a question before we move on. We can go ahead.
Okay, Tom or Councillor Lamb?
One of the things that
I think that's sounding better the second time around.
one of the things that might come into play here is the provincial rental, whatever it's called, the Rental Act or whatever it is, where if you go into a long-term rental, you have to abide by that. But when you go into a short-term rental, your people are in and out. And I know that's been an aggravation with myself in the past. And it was one of the reasons why for years there was never any purpose-built rental units being built. And I would say it was the provincial, the provincial regulations that impacted that.
If I may respond through the chair, Councillor Lamb, that is the next slide brings up this context as well. And so I'll just, if I could move on to this next slide.
Perfect, thank you.
Thank you. So in this section, I'll explain the context of homeowner revenue and homeownership affordability. And the poll after the slide is going to ask council your priorities on these two topics, and it'll repeat one of the questions you just did, but it'll just check in and keep checking in. And so council members are well aware that the average home price in the district of Sechelt has risen sharply in the past 5 years. And the short-term rentals decrease housing affordability in two main ways. As the dwelling units are converted to short-term rentals, the supply of housing shrinks and it drives prices up. And also the second way is that the ability to earn short-term rental revenue which often exceeds the revenue from renting out the unit long-term, leads some tenants and purchasers to bid up prices of housing. So these two harms are felt most acutely in communities that are already facing housing shortage and or affordability pressures, and where there's locally significant number of units that have been converted to short-term rentals. And while these harms might be intuitive, they're also being borne out in qualitative research studies. So what we've heard is that short-term rentals are providing rental income to homeowners who wish to have added revenue and flexibility. And the discussion often does balance around enabling supplemental income and offsetting the high cost of purchasing homes. There are many different reasons, as Councillor Lamb pointed out, that homeowners may prefer long-term to short-term rentals, or long-term or short-term rentals, and homeowners might not be able to rent their units long-term, either because it's their principal dwelling unit, they're going away on holidays, they want to rent for that period of time, or it's their cottage, or it's not easy to find a tenant that's willing to rent on a repeating fixed-term basis and can't commit to set dates for occupancy that are required in the new provincial regulations. And they can't afford to leave the unit vacant. So the next poll is asking if it's council's goal to help homeowners short-term rental their principal dwelling unit to help with affordability, and how urgent is that need in the community. So over to Catherine for the next poll. Unmute.
Pardon me. Thank you, Odette. We can go ahead and go back to the Menti. We've got two questions with this one. And again, a bit of a temperature check as we provide more information, seeing if your priorities shift. But this first one, we'll go ahead and take a look at the results as they come in, is looking at the source of homeowner revenue. So either encouraging revenue from long-term rentals or encouraging revenue from short-term rentals. Again, there's certainly a lot of space down the middle to do options that include both, but for the sake of this discussion, it's helpful for us to see where on the spectrum priorities are. So we've got 4 so far. We're just waiting on 1 more now. Great, so we've got all 6. We can go ahead then and move along to the second question. It looks very clear on this one that encouraging revenue from long-term rentals is a priority. So this second question is asking about home ownership affordability. So we've asked this one and just revisiting it now with the information in the previous slide. Is your priority to support future owners, so that's lower purchasing prices, or is your priority to support current owners, so higher monthly incomes and higher sale prices? I think we've got 4 responses so far. We'll just wait for the final 2. Right, we've just got 1 left. It's a tough one to choose either side. There's definitely a lot of gray area in the middle. It looks like we're very split with 3 and 3. And with that, we'll go ahead and go back to the presentation.
Thank you. And in this next section, I'll be presenting 3 slides. And it's first is acknowledging the importance of the tourism in Sechelt and the Sunshine Coast economy. And then I also want to touch on what the policy guidance says in the District of Sechelt today, and then ask Council where you wish to incentivize tourism investments. So the first is acknowledging that tourism is important to Sechelt and the Sunshine Coast economy. And the tourist accommodation revenues in the Sunshine Coast amounted to just over $25 million in 2020. There's also secondary spending at restaurants, shops, and employment ancillary businesses that are supported, cleaning, landscaping, maintenance, among others. So we've heard a desire to provide tourists with accommodation options for staying and visiting. And also we've heard from tourism businesses that they want a level playing field for the businesses that have higher operating costs. They may also want to update their accommodations to meet current market demands. However, residential short-term rentals are a source of competition for the tourism accommodation dollars. Currently, there are 249 active, unique short-term rental listings in the district of Sechelt, and we believe this includes bed and breakfasts that have transitioned in recent years to have private entrances, little interaction with owners, and they advertise on the same online platforms. There are also tourist accommodations with 4 hotels, motels operating 89 rooms combined, the 6 recreational vehicle mobile home parks, and 3 campgrounds that have active business licenses. So just a bit of context for who are the tourism providers today. And next slide is, we wanted to also check where does the District of Sechelt policies lie on short-term rentals today? And understandably, it's silent because the OCP is from 2011, and these really started to increase in 2015-16 with the rise of online platforms. But there are a couple of policies that relate to tourism and housing in Sechelt. And the policies also speak to directing tourist commercial uses to the downtown and your neighborhood centers in Davis Bay, Wilson Creek, and Tilikum Bay. And that new, I quote, new tourist commercial uses will be considered at other locations with the provision of adequate land area to support parking, related facilities, and overall compatibility with adjacent uses. So that's what your OCP says today. And I know that it's probably due for an update in the near future, but just to give you to provide a context for this policy direction. And then what does the strategic plan say? And it sets priorities to fulfill the District of Sechelt's vision, and the relevant objectives in your strategic plan are shown here, and that it's about continuing to support the tourism economy and leverage opportunities for promoting tourism, enhancing visitor experiences in Sechelt. And then there is also a directive of increasing housing affordability and addressing homelessness. And it focuses on lobbying senior levels of government to secure funding and other social supports, and working collaboratively to develop affordable housing strategies. So the next poll, over to Catherine to ask about the nature of tourism industry.
Great, thanks, Odette. So this poll, we've just got one question, and you can go ahead and go back to the Menti. So with this one, we'd like to know Council's priority with respect to supporting the tourism industry. Is it encouraging commercial guest accommodations or encouraging residential guest accommodations? Once again, there's several options in between that do some combination of the two, but for this purpose, we want to know where on that spectrum you land exactly. So we just got 4 responses. We're waiting for a couple more, but there looks to be some consensus amongst the first 4 that have participated. There's one more that, great, we've got all 6. And with that, we can go ahead and move back to the presentation. Thank you.
Thank you. And the next section is about neighborhood fit. And I provide one slide that explains the conditions of where short-term rentals and neighborhood complaints arise, and ask for councillors' perspectives on how to prioritize the management responsibility for short-term rentals. The District of Sechelt's bylaw enforcement and planning staff have explained that short-term rentals neighborhood complaints, which are often like the types of things that are complaints, are noise, party houses, backyard fires, parking, and that they are pretty much universally limited to unsupervised short-term rentals where there is no owner on site. And residents' concerns are with unhosted short-term rentals. And the December 2020 District of Sechelt survey that consulted with residents, stakeholders, community groups that received 374 survey responses last year, 216, so 60%, were in support of short-term rentals that have on-site operators. And an additional 30%, so 115, supported short-term rentals that have a responsible contact that lives very near to the short-term rental and can respond 24/7 within half an hour to, in a timely manner, to complaints that they are responsible for managing behaviors. And so that's a significant number, so 90%, that prefer hosted short-term rentals or those with a responsible contact that is available indeed. And so other forms of management and accountability that other communities in British Columbia use, in addition to having hosted rentals, are things like putting caps on the numbers of short-term rentals in the entire community or within specific neighborhoods, or require that an owner or on-site resident operator be present during guest stays, or treating that unhosted rentals or rentals where there's off-coast owners, for example, would be treated in a different category. So there's some other types of management accountability tools, and encouraging neighborhood fit is the next Menti poll that is related to what I've just presented. So over to Catherine.
Thank you, Odette. So again, with this one, we've just got one question. You can go ahead and go back to the Menti slides and start putting your responses in. I see we've already got one going in there, but we'd like to get a sense of Council's priority with respect to encouraging neighborhood fit. So the two options that you have are relying on the presence of on-site operators or relying on other forms of accountability that Odette has just discussed. Recognizing again that there are many options that fall in between in that gray space, but we'd like to know where on the spectrum your priorities lie. So we've got half of the responses so far. Just a couple left now. With these questions, we're really doing a quick temperature check to see where your thoughts are as we move through the presentation, if it's changing once you hear more information. Still just a couple there that we're waiting on. I'll assume that those that we're waiting on are just thinking about their responses before inputting them, and you're not having any difficulties answering the questions. But if you are and you need assistance.
I think we may be having some technical difficulties.
Okay, what's happening?
I got a note that one person says it won't refresh for them.
Oh.
Yeah, they can probably exit and come back in. Would that work?
Yeah.
Okay, and then I see Tom is leaving the call, so let's take a moment or two for everyone to refresh the page, hit back, go forward again.
The Menti will stay live and I'll move on, Catherine. So for whomever wishes to participate, we will be checking in at the end.
Just give us a minute. We're just doing a quick water break while we have these technical difficulties. Thank you.
Is there any
Okay,
trouble?
We can
Water,
also
water.
enter verbally. If it's stated verbally, we can enter it.
Would anyone who hasn't had a chance to vote on the online Menti thing want to say where they are?
The other option that we're able to do, here we
Oh,
go.
we got one.
Great. Okay, thank you.
If we wanted to maintain the anonymity of it, you can give your answer to somebody else in chambers that could input it on their phone. If needed.
And I believe Councillor Lamb is not, has exited, so I think we're ready to go to the next slide. Is that correct, Chair McLean?
I think he's nearby, but I'm going to say we can move forward.
Thank you. So we'll move to the next slide, please. And so the final section, the final set of slides is, I provide context for where the District of Sechelt compares with other communities and regulations and their monitoring and compliance and what the associated costs are and how they might be paid for. And I'll ask councillors to prioritize their preferred compliance and management approach. So currently there are 28 business licenses for bed and breakfast at this time and 97 business licenses for short-term rentals at this time. So the estimated compliance with business licensing is 50% or less. And the current basic business license fee is $125 or $175 if there's a second home-based business operating on the property, because it could be a bed and breakfast. In addition, short-term rentals have a $1,000 security bond that's held to offset associated costs with investigations or enforcement actions. However, in practice, the bond has never been used in that manner, and the security deposit has been returned when businesses cease to operate. Currently, short-term rentals regulations are enforced on a complaint basis, and they're not proactively checked. When compared to other communities, there are a limited number that are not proactive, and increasing business license fees to pay for added compliance and monitoring and associated staffing is the norm. So Sechelt sits on the more permissive side of just requiring the business license and the security bond, as I mentioned. And then other communities also have like limits based on neighborhood or their community of short-term rentals. I'm just, as we're moving down to the right side, I'm describing a little bit of the context. Many have an on-site residency requirement that the owner must be on site or a operator. And some have rezoning requirements that require the use to be, if it's not on-site operator, then having additional conditions and having even caps on the number that can be from out of community owners that are unhosted. So there's a variety of different uses or management tools, and then on the furthest right of prohibiting them altogether, where there's really problems with not having enough housing in communities. That's a response that has been used. And so the enforceability of regulations, next slide, is typically done with the support of a third-party compliance monitoring company called Host Compliance or Granicus, and it's based on, their fee is based on the number of short-term rentals that are operating in the community. So for the District of Sechelt today, having an added tool to track short-term rentals and support their monitoring notification when they're not in compliance, and having a 24/7 call line, those types of supports, it would be approximately $16,000 a year. And this tool is very commonly used by communities in all over North America. And it's supports and compliance monitoring and tracks all of the permitting to support staff to do that work. It also generates monthly reports and provides addresses of properties that are not in compliance and are, for example, advertising without a business license. Next slide, please. So I just wanted to put this in perspective that the median nightly rate for short-term rentals in the District of Sechelt today is $220 Canadian a night, and the average is somewhere between 200, 242, and the median is income for operators is just under $4,000 every month over a 12-month period. The average monthly income is a bit less in January, as you would expect, $1,795, and higher in the peak months. Just under $6,000 is the August revenue. And so the next poll will be launched by Catherine.
Great. So we've got just one question here with monitoring and compliance, looking at where council's priorities lie with respect to tourism accommodation units and those different options for monitoring and compliance. So either relying on an honor system for business management or relying on proactive monitoring and compliance systems that are put in place. So, Chair, I might ask you if we're waiting for 6 responses or if we've gotten all 5 responses that we'll have.
Let's hold up maybe another 30 seconds to see if we get the last one.
Sure. Those responses all came in so quickly. It's like you were all ready to get them in there.
We're eager to address this issue.
Absolutely. We'll wait a few more moments to see if we get one more response there.
Hey, Matt.
Go ahead, Tom, and I think you need to turn down your volume. A little echoey there.
There you go. I'm just having a little hard to believe that I'd be the one having a technical difficulty, but that's me. So you've got 5 and I would vote.
We're not laughing at all.
No, neither am I, but you'd get 6 for me there. So I'll tell you that. I'm going to just try and log in again on the other side.
Perfect. Thanks, Councillor Lamb.
Thank you, Councillor. With that, I think we can close this one, and I'll note your response in there so that it's reflected in our summary. Thank you, Councillor. And we have just one last question, and before you start putting this question in, I'll make sure that you know that we need to get all of the responses in before you hit submit. And I just wanted to say that because I know you'll want to start putting it in as in talking, but I'd just like to get a sense of all of the areas that we've discussed today, seeing where your priorities are. So there are 5 options in there, and you'll be prompted to select an option as your first option, and then select an option as your second option, and so on until you get through all 5. You can, once you've put those all in, you can still reorganize them before you hit submit. So don't worry if you select one too quickly and it's not in the right place. But once you hit submit, then it will submit those responses as they are. So you can go ahead and start with those priorities. And I'll share my screen once we've got some of the priorities coming in.
And so just to give a bit of context, the prioritization on the slide very early on when I was set out those 5 priorities of what would council direct as your goals that are most important to achieve for short-term rental regulations? Where would you put the highest priority in these 5? And so over to you to consider that. And we've had 2 responses so far. So we are awaiting all 6 to come in, and they can also be put in chat and we can enter them in should there be any technical difficulties. The challenge with showing it in real time is, influencing others' views. So we wanted to reduce that. That's why we were hiding the screen, just to allow, we're minimizing influence or bias. That was really the intent.
So perhaps could we read out the options again? Maybe if Councillor Lamb wants to cast a verbal vote or send a text or something like that, or maybe he has the app going.
Yeah. So Catherine, the best way to do it without bias is to show slide number 4, to go back in the PowerPoint, and because the priorities are coming in the order that council is submitting them.
And here they are on the screen. I can also put these into the chat if that's helpful.
We don't have the typical chat set up on this.
As I said that, I realized I didn't have a chat to access, but they're on the screen there.
So I'll just check in with you, Councillor Lamb. How would you like to vote on this one?
Well, I believe we've got to support all of them almost, you need the business and the regulatory stuff, and you need the long-term rental. So every one of those works.
Yeah, I think the activity is to try and prioritize some of them. So is there perhaps one that you would push to the top?
Well, I'm gonna go with the bottom one, business and regulatory equity.
And then can we get any more of you? Second, third, fourth, fifth?
I don't know. You want me to give you a 1 to 5 on this, Matt?
That's what we all had to do.
Okay. So number 1, business would be number 1. Number 2. Well, yeah, number 2 would be protection of long-term. Oh man.
It's certainly tough, and it's a big ask to ask you to prioritize all of
And
them.
encouraging a neighborhood fit would be 3. Supporting tourism be 4, and number 5 would be enabling supplemental income.
Thank you. Okay, Catherine will show these as the results are now in, and Catherine will also be updating it at the end. So yeah, we'll also update this with Councillor Lamb's inputs. It'll just take a moment, but and then I'll go to the next slide. So encouraging neighborhood fit is the top priority, and protection of long-term rental supply. Okay.
Great.
And Catherine, you'll just add those two while I'm on the next slide, and they'll be reflected as a whole of 6. Okay. Next slide, please. And so just to want to give a context here, Catherine is currently summarizing the Mentimeter poll results, and she'll present this summary shortly. And this whole exercise was intended to walk through and make the trade-offs explicit and to show where there are areas of alignment in priorities and where there are areas that might need resolution. So just giving Catherine a few moments to provide a summary. We did see quite a few areas of alignment already. So in this presentation, we walked through some of the context around the nature of this challenging topic and how to determine regulations also requires focusing on the current context and the unique priorities of your community. And there was data that was presented to give the context of what is the scale of short-term rentals today, your current system and its compliance, and how significant these incomes are. Like, what does it mean? And also in relative terms to your current housing stock. And so many communities are using some regulatory tools that are designed to address issues and priorities that are unique to their context. And really, there is nothing that can be pulled off the shelf from another community and said, this is going to work for Sechelt. It is really requires to each community, unique to what is your objective. And some communities choose to put caps on the numbers of short-term rentals over the entire community or a specific neighborhood. Some require owner, residents, operators to be present during guest stays. Others put limits on short-term rental accommodations and what types of units they can be permitted in. And some require rezoning to become short-term tourist vacation rental uses. They create a different category. So there's a range of regulatory tools, management and compliance and enforcement practices that are part of the suite of what is appropriate for the district of Sechelt. So this was really helpful to hear that where there was alignment and a really strong down the line, we heard from council that there is no tolerance for housing loss, encouraging revenue from long-term rentals, encouraging commercial guest accommodations so that they invest in those, and the use of proactive monitoring and compliance tools. Those were clearly areas of alignment. And now I'd like to check with, before I move on to give the Catherine, she'll give a summary screen of how these results came in. I just wanted to check with Chair McLean to see how much time is available for discussion in this meeting, to see where there's areas that might not have alignment and need resolution. How much time is there for a facilitated discussion? So Chair McLean, just wanting to check with you. I understand there might be other items on the agenda, so just wanting to be mindful of that.
I'm just going to pass it over to our corporate officer.
If I understand correctly, I believe the next item is scheduled for approximately 4:25 p.m. So you have almost a half an hour, close to.
Perfect. Thank you, Ms. Frank. I do have a question at this point. So would it be appropriate to jump into a couple questions?
Mm-hmm. And Councillor Chair McLean, would you like to see the results? Summary of results first, or ask questions first?
Let's do results first.
Okay. Catherine, over to you.
Great. Just bringing up the right screen here. So Odette did walk through some of these areas, but I just wanted you to see visually where the results were. So with respect to protection of long-term rental supply, full consensus there with no tolerance for housing loss, a 50-50 split with supporting current owners or supporting current renters. A lot of gray area in that question though. And looking at enabling supplemental income, full consensus there with encouraging revenue from long-term rentals. and then a 50-50 split with the current owners or renters prioritization. And then looking at the nature of the tourism industry, about 80% encouraging residential guest accommodations, 20% encouraging commercial guest accommodations.
We have a couple questions on that one, so I just ask that you double check the numbers there.
Yeah, it seemed like it was the opposite. So we will check those numbers it was very much encouraging commercial guest accommodation is the results. So that there's an error there.
Thank you. I'll make a note of that. With encouraging neighborhood fit, not so much of a consensus here, a 60-40, 60 for relying on forms of accountability and 40 for relying on the presence of on-site operators. And then with monitoring and compliance, a bit more of a consensus here with 80% recommending proactive monitoring and compliance systems put in place. And then
again, on that one, I think it might have
been
different.
Yeah. Okay.
And I just want to bring up the this screen again now that we have Councillor Lamb's votes in here. You can see where those priorities are with first to fifth. So first being that encouraging neighborhood fit. Second is the protection of the long-term rental supply. Third is promoting business and regulatory equity. Fourth is supporting the tourism industry. And fifth is enabling supplemental income.
Yeah, thank you. This is helpful to see how the temperature check where things lied in priorities. And we'll just double check the results. My apologies. I noticed a couple that didn't quite come out, and we'll just double check those results and we'll provide them at the conclusion of this meeting. Chair McLean, you had a question.
Yeah, just as you were going through the presentation, I did have one question regarding the use of full dwellings. I'm wondering if from that software that tracks the short-term rentals, is there information on the number of bedrooms that they have? Do we have any idea if they're one-bedroom basement suites versus four-bedroom whole house rentals?
I was not able to get that information through Host Compliance Granicus as an initial consultation with them. I believe that when you pay for their services, that you can have much more of a dive in the data access. I did not have access to that.
Okay, thank you. Mayor Seegers?
Yeah, further to that, I think when we're talking about whole house or whole building, we need to be able to distinguish between a house or a cabin or a subsequent building on the property. And I don't know. We could potentially reach out to some of the, maybe Sunshine Coast Tourism, for example. They have access to the software, and maybe Powell River as well. Mm-hmm. So we could ask if that information is available inside of the monitoring.
Thank you. And through the chair to Mayor Seegers, just to also advise that we were in close communication with Sunshine Coast Tourism, and they were very generous in sharing data that we verified was consistent with ours in this research, as well as the City of Powell River and the system that they have just last year adopted to regulate short-term rentals. And they pay for the Host Compliance Granicus service.
Perfect, thank you. Do we have any other questions for council before I step in? Mayor Seegers?
So one of the questions that I have around this, and it has nothing to do with how we regulate, but it's a question that comes up for me all the time, and is how do we transition? Because what I am aware of is that there are certain areas of our communities, in some cases whole streets, where the majority of them are short-term rentals. And if we were to look at something like a particular number in a neighborhood, how do we actually transition? I mean, I'm not saying we're going to go that way, but how do we actually transition something like that?
Yes. So through the chair to Mayor Seegers, the bylaws would be drafted in a manner that has a phase-in period. So because also tourism operators are planning many months out and need to secure accommodations and guarantee what they've been offering for some months. So typically you would have an effective date. And also to say that with business licensing and this context, it is effective as of the date that the municipality sets. There is no such thing as grandfathering. So, it requires compliance with the business licensing requirements in that next calendar year. So you have a certain amount of phase in and, just basically giving notice of these upcoming new regulations.
Okay, thank you. I had Councillor Scott next.
I think it's pretty straightforward. I mean, if we're going to decide that we are going to limit the amount of short-term rentals in a given area, the one way we can look at this is we decide how many per square kilometer we're going to allow or such. Like they say, there's no grandfathering. We decide that they're going to have to bid. And the bid money can go into an affordable housing reserve.
Thank you, Councillor Scott. I did have one question going back to the presentation. There was a scale in the presentation talking about the approaches taken by different people, page 26 of our agenda, 23 of your report. Can you just explain the residency requirement again? Was that for local property owners or was that more for people living on property? Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's the one.
Mm-hmm. Yes, thank you, Chair McLean. So there's a few different ways that residency requirements happen. So for example, in Tofino, there needs to be an owner on or an operator on site on the property during every guest stay. In Vancouver, Fernie, Squamish, that it needs to be for the principal residence, the principal where the owner lives, that they can have up to one unit. So it could be a secondary suite or an accessory cottage on their property where they live. That is, in some are more restrictive even within that. That it, for example, in Vancouver can't be an accessory dwelling, that it has to be within the principal residence only. So in Powell River, residency requirement is you need to live within the city of Powell River, and there are a maximum of 10 short-term rental, vacation rentals is what they call them, a different category for off-coast owners. And they've had not that much demand, only 3 out of 10 have actually taken up on that licensing requirement, that is when you are not a resident of the Powell River. So there's a few different ways to say it. There's so many variations depending on what's appropriate and responding to the needs of that community.
Perfect, thank you. Was there anything else Council wanted to touch on before we go, I believe, into our facilitated discussion? Seeing none, back over to you, Odette.
So Catherine, if you can just stop the share screen. So the areas where we saw, there was many areas where we saw alignment and in wanting to protect housing and long-term rentals. And then the area where there was the greatest disparity. Now I'm wanting to ask Catherine if you can look at the results, because just to have a conversation around, is there areas for reconciling to find better alignment and objectives?
Yes. I just fixed those slides that were incorrect. So why don't we go through them again so we can see where those areas were.
That'd be great. Thank you.
So this was the first one that we had, strong alignment, no tolerance for housing loss, but then we had a 50-50 split with supporting current renters or supporting current owners. And then did we want to discuss these by slide, Odette, or did we?
Just to maybe pull off the slide for now. Yeah, so with regards to that question of, there is an impact on housing costs, and they're not just housing costs for renters. It is also the housing market. Can you stop share screen, please? And so the question being, how much does council see that they wish to have tools to create a market lever that will have an impact on housing, both ownership and rental? Or does council feel that that's not a role that they want to play?
All right, to council. I got Councillor Scott first, then Mayor Seegers.
I don't think that we have a choice. We have to take a role in it. That's what the residents are asking of us. The problem with that slide is it's too black and white. There's any one of us wants to protect long-term housing supply, but we also realize that there is a need for other stuff too. So it is about creating that balance. Now, if we put in enough of the controls that we need to ensure that there's accountability in the short-term rental market, I think you'll see that there'll be an increase in the long-term rental housing, because it'll just hit the too hard file for some. But at least we'll be able to control it. We'll have better neighborhoods. I think we'll see better gains all around.
Mayor Seegers.
If we focus on supporting current owners versus supporting renters, I think what we will see is there won't be as many investing in a property for short term, right? Which actually drives up the cost. The other side, though, in current owners are looking to get a return, that particularly those who are looking to sell their houses and move, maybe downsize or, stay within the community. They're looking at getting a decent return for their property because they've lived in it for many, many, many years. So, I'm like Councillor Scott, it's not black and white. I mean, it's impacting everybody in the community. But we have heard from everybody in the community that they want to make sure that we do take a hand in this and put some legislation in place. In the end, it's all about community livability is what they're wanting. They want the community to represent the values that they have.
Thank you. Is there anyone else who wants to jump in? Maybe I'll say a word or two. I agree. I think the question was posed, do we want to play a hand in this or just let it go? And I think short-term rentals have played a huge hand in how housing has unfolded on the Sunshine Coast over the last while. So I think we need to try and counteract some of that effect that it has had on our housing market on both sides, on the rental, reducing some of that supply, and on the ownership side, increasing some of those houses because you can generate all that extra revenue. Councillor Toth.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, it is a tough one. I think one thing that we need to be mindful of, though, is, when we're looking at supporting renters, we do have over 200 units of housing, rental housing in the pipeline now. There are other initiatives going on, the Affordable Housing Society, things like that. honestly, when it comes to, you know, current owners getting the return on their investment, the housing market here has done such crazy things in the last 5 years that anybody who's looking to downsize or has been in their home for any length of time, even if there is a softening of the market here, they're still going to do really well for themselves. And anybody who's just bought is looking to try and make a quick buck and turn around and flip it in a year, they might get burned. But we're not looking to support those people necessarily through this work. So.
All right, thank you. I think that's all from council at this point. Not seeing any other hands.
Thank you. If I could just share our last slide and to talk about next steps then. We are able to come back to present recommended regulations to the Committee of the Whole on December 22nd. Should Council wish to advance quickly, we are ready to do so and eager to do so. It's really, if you would wish to have us do that and return. And then if there is support for recommended regulations, that are presented and there can be agreement on them, then we could move ahead with targeted stakeholder and community at large public consultation in the new year. Catherine, actually, my apologies if you can take the slide off. And that would include very specific consultation that would be around proposed regulations. So there's been quite a lot of feedback over the years, and in December 2020, most recently, that has been general in nature about the topic of short-term rentals. There's a high participation rate when you engage about short-term rentals. So it's really, is council comfortable with a suite of regulations that is proposed and ready for specific feedback? So we would be, if it pleases the chair and mayor and council for us to return, we will gladly do so and present regulations and report back. Can I just pass it over to Andrew for next steps as well, because I think you're probably in a better position to speak to this too.
At your discretion, Chair McLean, I see that you were ready to turn your microphone on as well, but I'll keep this brief and echo that we understood that these questions were going to be difficult. We understand that this whole topic is difficult. I think we talked about that months ago, that there is no easy solution. This isn't a problem that exists only in Sechelt. This is a problem that exists broadly in many areas, not even just British Columbia. So how do we resolve that, and what do we want to do specifically in Sechelt to play our part? That's what we're looking. So yes, we are prepared to bring some regulations forward so we can get onto this into the new year. So over to you. Thank you.
Perfect. I see Councillor Lamb with his hand on.
Yeah, one of the things that I've just been thinking about this, but these are small businesses. If it's short-term rental, and so there should be some kind of compensation to the taxpayer, the rest of the taxpayers, the community, in the fact that these will use extra amenities, and so especially like if they're on the sewer system, there should be a little bit of an extra tax, or just something. I think we have to look at it from a whole bunch of different directions. That's all I got to say. Thank you.
Mayor Seegers.
Thank you. I guess this would be for the presenters. So, I mean, in some areas, we've been pretty black and white. We've gone 100% in some areas. So are we anticipating that the legislation will come back, or the proposed draft would come back reflecting that, and that when it goes out to the community, there may be some tweaks to that in response to what's happening in the community? I'm just looking at how is this actually play out in implementation?
Thank you. Through the chair to Mayor Seegers. Yes, the regulations would present, there's a regulatory side and a management and an enforcement side. So draft would be presented in a scale of where, in the scale of each of these three categories, what we perceive from what we've heard and our background research that is a good place to sit in a broader range than the binary. Here's where other communities lie, and here's where we think Seashelt would fit in these areas of the tools. And then seeking council confirmation. Only once council confirmation is provided, then seeking stakeholder and public input and allowing space to allow some flexibility, checking with council again. Is there a desire to change this? And that's why the prioritizing process is really helpful to, there are some things that would undermine other objectives if everything was changeable. It's complex. Mm-hmm.
So,
Yeah, thank you. That helps.
okay. If I can, as chair, I see this as the first step. This is probably the closest thing we've had at this council table to a substantive policy discussion on short-term rentals. We've mentioned it many times, but this is starting down the path of adopting a policy. So personally, I would like to see a draft policy come forward in an expedient manner. And what that does is it puts something on the table that we can bring to the community and say, what about this solution? Are we able to implement this? What would the impacts be? So I think the sooner we get something like that on the table, we can really have productive conversations with each other and with the community about what we'd like to see in terms of short-term rentals. So I do look forward to seeing it in a expedited manner on December 22nd. Nice little Christmas present. Councillor Lamb.
Just a real brief note, but this is not a Seashelt problem, it's a worldwide problem. And the new government in Germany has come out and said that they are going to build 400,000 units for rental accommodation. There's a country in Asia that with a capital, and it's South Korea. In their capital, they want to build 83,000 units for rental. So it's just everywhere, and it is what it is. And there's a bunch of other information too, but that's it for me. Thanks.
Yeah, and I think at the end of the day, this is a land use decision that comes down to the level of municipal governments in Canada. So while everyone is dealing with it, it's up to us to deal with it from Seashelt. I don't think this is one we can put off on a lot of other forms of government. A lot of it comes back down to us. Councillor Scott?
Thanks, Chair. I guess one of the things that, I feel like we're really just scratching here. It's not as deep as I thought it would go today. So I'm just going to actually ask the EcoPlan group, because one of the things that I'm really interested in understanding is communities that have limited the amount of short-term rentals in a certain area. I'd like to know what the density how they choose that density and what level that is. So, like I say, is it so many per square kilometer? Is it so many on a street? Can they be side by side? I'm guessing that would come down to rezoning. And then other questions I have on that is, if you look at communities like I think Golden and Revelstoke have specific rezoning that they do for short-term rental, what does that do for their property? Like if you had a house side by side that both went up for sale and one zoned for short-term rental, do they make more money with it? And what does that look like? And some of these questions that I'd like to discuss and get answers for.
All right. I think the conversation is beginning, and it is in earnest. but we're heading down that track. Councillor Toth.
Thank you, Chair. And, in the report, it's mentioned that there's almost no issue with the owner-occupied or the hosted short-term rentals. So really it comes down to fitting into our neighborhoods, and whether that's more properties that are being owner-occupied or whether that's more properties being long-term tenanted. I think everybody wins in a situation where you've got either of those. One thing that I do know some communities have done with specialty use zoning, I don't know if short-term rentals has been done this way, but I know cannabis has been done this way, which is a separate zoning overlay that you can apply for, and you can go through that process. So it doesn't change the base zone for the property, but it permits that use on the property as sort of an extra layer of zoning. So I don't know if that's something that's been used in the short-term rental side of things, but just another piece.
All right, would anyone else like to jump in? Perfect. Odette and Catherine, I really want to thank you for your time in presenting today, and I want to thank you for putting together this preliminary report, and I look forward to seeing the policy on December 22nd.
Thank you very much. Pleasure being here this afternoon.
Thank you.
All right, Mayor, those were waves, not questions. Okay, I see hands and I react. Alrighty, so with that, I think we're going to move to item 5.2, and I see our guest has arrived. And I believe this will start with a report from corporate officer? Beverly? Okay, so to our manager of financial services.
Thank you, Chair McLean. I'm just going to do a quick intro. So I'd like to introduce to you Corey Vanderhorst, our auditor from the financial accounting firm MNP. Mr. Vanderhorst is going to present to you today the new asset retirement obligation and the accounting rules for this new requirement. Over to you, Mr. Vanderhorst.
Great, thank you. Can you hear me okay? Thumbs up? Great, awesome.
Yes, so we have two people named Corey.
Yes, you can see Graham Roberts is joining us as well. Graham is a senior manager with us and has been involved with the Seashell audit for many years now. So I asked him to join as well. I believe you have a copy of the presentation. Do I have access to share screen? Let's see here. Oh, yes, perfect. Thank you. So
I don't believe we have a copy of the presentation.
Okay, then I will share screen. And hopefully this. You guys go. All right. Are you able to see the first slide now?
I see the back end, so I see all the menu as well.
Yeah. Let's do this. Full screen. There we go.
That's the one.
Perfect. Thank you. So I have. Sorry, I just want to make sure I can still see everybody. There we go. Okay, we'll dive in. Thank you for having me here today. Thank you to Bev for the introduction. I've got a few slides to go through, try to keep it high level to just give you an understanding of this new accounting standard that's coming down the line. It's going to be a significant amount of work for your finance team and others at the district. So just wanted to have a chance to look at it, to think about it, and have a chance for council to ask questions. So diving right in, the overview, the timing of what we're looking at here is this is going to be showing up in your 2023 financial statements. So that feels like a long way away, but only a couple years from now. And with the way that this new standard gets implemented, you actually need to have some information for January 1st, 2023. So that's coming up really quick, just about a year of runway for your finance team. So when the standard setters who sit in Toronto and get feedback from around the country, we're looking at the accounting standards that local governments uses and looking at what's out there for potential liabilities and things that are coming along the, and if, will be part of what you're managing. We know there's been a lot of conversation around asset management plans, knowing when things are going to need to be replaced, knowing what condition your infrastructure is in. It is a very big issue, with the recent floods. We saw the state of infrastructure on highways and dams and things like that. So that's all kind of part of the larger conversation. So when they drilled down into capital assets, they started looking at, does a municipality, does the district, does the city, or does the regional district have a liability coming up, have an outlay that's going to need to happen? And they've identified here with asset retirement obligations that there are clear liabilities that are coming on certain types of assets. Whether you've got landfill, other types of heavy industry, public works yards, fire halls, hockey arenas. The ice plant in a hockey arena it's got some it's pretty nasty chemicals in them. So there's rules around what you have to do to clean those up. So they started identifying there's a liability coming, and we haven't been tracking it. We haven't been paying attention to it, and it hasn't been in your financial statements. So the standard is developed to enhance the information that council has when you're making decisions. You'll now have a liability on the books and know that something is coming up. Helps your staff as they prepare budgets and the longer range budgets, the 5 years and beyond of when is a cost coming up. Helps you to understand the full cost of a tangible asset. If you build a new pool or a new hockey arena, you also will then be accounting for the fact that that the ice plant might last 20 years and then it needs to be replaced, and you'll have a liability for that replacement. So hopefully it improves the decision making about purchasing or constructing assets, that full cost approach. And then it gives you this sense of how to handle obligations to retire capital assets, to decommission them, that are predictable and unavoidable. You're going to have this cost. So now you've got it tracked and you've got it measured for financial purposes. So the accounting rules, and again, without getting too far into the weeds on accounting standards, there's a few criteria that need to be met. So there's a legal obligation. Either it's being driven by a ministry standard or you have a contract. We are also looking at leases being in scope. You might have a 99-year crown lease that requires you to return the property to its natural state. Well, that's going to be an asset retirement obligation. And you may realistically not trigger that. I've got another community that has a museum sitting on a 99-year lease. They're not going to tear the museum down, but we have to account for what they do. So the past transaction there, number two, generally that's you bought the asset or you constructed it. So that's the past transaction. The future economic benefit, you're going to pay something to clean it up, right? The classic example is landfills. We know there's costs for closure of landfills. There's costs for post-closure monitoring. That one we've been tracking for years now. The asset retirement obligation section now expands beyond just landfills. And then can we make a reasonable estimate? This is where the engineers, whether in-house at the district or external engineers, would come in to say, we need to have some sort of estimate of what remediation, decommissioning, demolition, what all those costs would be, and then a good sense of when that's going to happen. Is it 10 years from now? Is it 100 years from now? We need to be able to ballpark those and have the best estimate we can possibly make. So with legal obligations, I already mentioned that it might come out of legislation, including you may have your own bylaws that would trigger a legal obligation. We're going to be looking at both your finance staff and the auditors are going to be looking at contracts and agreements, any clauses in there that require you to decommission an asset. Or there's also the third bullet point there, this idea of illegally enforceable obligation. So the example we're given here is You might have a resident that purchased a property beside, a gravel pit or an industrial site or a public works yard because the district had made a public promise to close and decommission it. So that might not, you might not be legislated. It might be not any laws or bylaws around that decommissioning. That might not be in a contract anywhere, but that third party has relied on the public notice of closure when they made their purchase. So you have an obligation under that what the lawyers call promissory estoppel. So your finance department and your other district staff are going to go through this exercise of looking for the capital assets that have these asset retirement obligations attached to them, inventorying and listing it all out. Then you've got to measure it. So when we measure it, for example's sake, I'm going to use a real simple one. We calculate a liability of $100,000 in 10 years time. So what we're going to do is we're going to actually increase the carrying value of the capital asset. We're going to add to the asset value, and the offset is a liability. We're going to start with a small liability, and then it's going to increase over time. We're going to have what we call an accretion expense. We're going to increase the liability so that by the end of the 10 years on your books, you will have a $100,000 liability sitting there. When you go to pay it, it just relieves that liability. And again, it's always going to be an estimate. We're going to try and get as close as possible. You might have assets on your books that are what we call fully amortized. So let's say it's an older asset, like a building where we've already amortized it, but you're still using it. We might be adding to that asset and amortizing it. So there's going to be a few potentially weird scenarios that pop up, but the idea is we're going to put a liability on the books. We are also going to be putting an asset on. So then after 2023, as I mentioned, it's an estimate. It's going to be revisited every year. Part of the your finance department's year-end processes will be looking at that liability. Is there new information? Has the time to decommissioning changed? Is there a new estimate of how much it'll cost? If we thought it was $100,000 to decommission, has that now increased to $150,000? Has the legislation changed? The Ministry of Environment can throw new, change their thresholds, throw new things in, require a different way to decommission something. We're having conversations right now over old asbestos pipes and whether the actual standard is leave it or fill it with concrete or rip it up. So these are sometimes moving targets with what the Ministry of Environment is saying that you would have to do with it. Then we would have that annual accretion expense that I mentioned. There's going to be a new expense going on to the income statement or the statement of operations side. So it is going to affect your financial results on an annual basis. And like any estimate, there is measurement uncertainty. There may be challenges to predicting the timing, the amount that it's going to cost. That uncertainty doesn't remove the obligation or the liability, but it might affect the measurement. If we're moving a decommissioning from 10 years out to 15 years out, it's going to change the estimate amount there. And that's where your finance team, our audit team will apply professional judgment, and there may need to be third-party engineering expertise brought to bear on some of the assets that get identified. One of the things that's great about having these conversations early is your finance staff and us as well. We are talking with the other communities around the coastal region and the island. We're talking with the other audit firms. We're all trying to share information. If one community has, an ice rink with 2 sheets of ice, we're going to be sharing who came up with an estimate for decommissioning that. Do I have a similar asset and I can apply a similar amount? The expectation here isn't that everybody has to run out and spend money with the engineers. That's not what the goal is. The goal is to try and find out this information, find out what these liabilities are, and we are all encouraging the sharing of information as much as we can. So, and apologies, there's a lot going on in this slide. I'm going to try and boil it down. Because we're putting a new liability on the books, we're recording a new account for the financial statements. The standard setters have given 3 different options for how to record it. Fundamentally, the first 2, the retroactive application and the modified retroactive application, have the similarity that you're going to be restating 2022. So we're going to have a prior period adjustment. We're going to put the liability into 2022, and you'll have a whole bunch of note disclosure around restatement. The difference between number 1 and 2 is whether we use current estimates and discount rates, or whether we try to go back and we say, okay, that building was built 40 years ago. What was the rates attached to and the estimates 40 years ago, right? So I expect out of those 2, most people would land it at number 2. It's going to be a little bit easier to come up with the information using current assumptions. The third option is what they call prospective. So you do not restate 2022 results. You stick the liability on in 2023, and you roll forward. What that's going to do, it might sound like it's a lot easier because it's not going back to restate 2022. What it's going to do is it's actually going to result in larger capital asset and liability numbers in 2023, and potentially more expense line items as you go forward, because the larger value comes on, as opposed to in the retroactive, you are going back to when that asset was purchased or constructed, and you'll be bringing on a smaller amount. So there's no right or wrong answer there. It is a decision for finance staff to look at, and we're happy to walk through the implications of that, because fundamentally your liability amount will be the same in terms of, if you got 10 years down the line, it should still be that $100,000 liability, but it does affect your annual results in different ways. And so we're going to need to think about that and what type of messaging goes out to the public with these different options for application. So some key takeaways. Again, we are looking at legal obligations associated with the retirement of an asset. So if there's something that you would not legally be obligated to remediate or decommission, you wouldn't be booking a liability. We're going to increase the carrying amount of your capital assets. There's going to be an increase there in that 2023 year. If we have an item that's no longer being used, so let's say we have an old public works yard and it hasn't been used for a long time, we would end up expensing that amount when we set up the liability. So there is the potential for some items going straight to the income statement as an expense. Your routine replacement, you've got your asset management plan. It says 10 years from now, I'm replacing an asset, or I'm replacing a roof, or I'm replacing an ice plant at an arena. That's not an asset retirement obligation. That's just your replacement. You're not legally obligated to do that. But the decommissioning at the end of life of an asset is the asset retirement obligation. So the district will be adopting this for January 1, 2023. It will show up in your December 31st, 2023 financial statements. And so we strongly encourage the proactive planning, and I know your team has already been looking at this, and we've had conversations with them about their progress. So this is a quick, what a project outline would look like for your district staff. Again, reviewing your capital assets, identifying which ones have retirement obligations, vehicle fleet and other types of equipment probably doesn't have an ARO attached to it. Buildings, infrastructure, water, sewer, landfill, some of those things. Reviewing contracts and agreements to see if there's any clauses that require you to decommission an asset. legislation, including your own. So then you're developing that inventory. Look at any promises that might be legally enforceable. Have you made any public announcements, or if you, as a council, have you passed a motion that would indicate that you were going to do something about a problem property that again, that you either are owning or leasing? And then once you've got that listing of the potential AROs, then you get into calculating and putting a value to the liability, estimating costs for decommissioning and when it's going to happen. So this is a rough idea of a project timeline to ensure a successful and smooth transition for this, what could be a large project for the finance team. So that's the end of my presentation. I'll leave the sharing up. I think I can see everybody. If anybody wants me to flip back to any specific slides, I'd be happy to, and happy to answer questions.
Okay, if you wouldn't mind, could you take the sharing down just so we can see everyone's face?
Absolutely.
Thank you very much.
There we go.
Okay. And questions from council. Mayor Seegers.
Thank you. You talked about the 3 different ways that we can do this. What I think you said was, if we use the first 2 methods, we actually add on to our asset list. So we basically increase the value of our assets, and then we have a liability that we set up that corresponds to that. Where the third one, we don't add on to the assets, but we do have an expense. Is that correct?
Thank you, Madam Mayor. So to clarify, on all 3 scenarios, you would be adding assets and liabilities, but because you're not restating 2022 in the first ones, you end up with a larger asset and liability on the third prospective one, which then when you amortize those assets, you end up with more expenses. So you're right. More expense shows up in your income statement on that third option, whereas the first 2 take some of that liability and plunk it back into 2022, and it actually evens it out a little bit better. Hopefully that.
Okay. Thank you. That clarifies that. I have more questions, but if there's somebody else, I'll come back.
Okay, I'm going to ask a simple question just to break it down into tangible examples so we're all on the same page. For example, we have a lot of roads in the district of Seashelt that would not be included because it's not an obligation to repair. Whereas I can think of an example of our septage receiving facility, which has a lease which expires in 2031. That would count because we do have an obligation to take apart that facility.
Yeah, absolutely. I would be in agreement with that. Roads in general, unless there's a weird quirk or clause behind a piece of property or right of way or anything like that you have a road on, generally we're probably not going to see an arrow there. But yes, anything related to leased land, septic disposal, wastewater, solid waste, anything in those areas, you're probably going to have some sort of legal obligation or contractual, and with a lease there, you would have a contractual obligation to pay something at the end of the lease. Yeah.
Perfect. Thank you. And I'll go to the mayor.
Thank you. When you come and work with us as, municipalities, regional district, whatever, you always talk about materiality, right? So there's a number, and that's based on basically the size of the budgets, et cetera, that we work from. So is that also going to be something that will be here as well? Will there be a threshold? If it's under this, we're just going to expense it. If it's over this, we actually have to do this asset retirement obligation? And has that been determined yet?
That's a great question. Materiality absolutely comes into play. What we'll be doing and working with staff as they go through the project, and we'll be looking at, the best example I can give is, an underground oil tank or gasoline tank. Some of the ones that we've seen haven't cost a lot to pull out of the ground. If the tank has not leaked or spilled any contaminants or anything like that, we've seen very minor costs of removing and pulling some soil out, and immaterial to the financial statements overall, usually. You know, anytime a tank actually leaks, it tends to get much more expensive. But in those cases, staff will be going through, talking with us and saying, okay, I've identified an ARO. There may be some that are material and just have to get recorded. But if staff goes through the exercise and says, you know what, we went through it, there's only about $25,000 here of asset retirement obligations. Can we agree that it doesn't need to get recorded? It's immaterial. We will note it, and it could potentially be off, not recorded. We do have another community that we work with, very small, not a lot of infrastructure because it's very close to a bunch of other municipalities. It will probably have nothing to record. They have a town hall, they have a fire hall, and they have a public works department. We're going to look at the public works and the fire hall, and that's about it. So it depends community by community on the mix of assets, on what you're managing. If there are things that the regional district is managing that you are not managing, that's great. They might have a big liability record and you won't have to. So it's absolutely something that, I'm going to ask Bev and the team to keep in touch with us on progress so that we can make those calls on whether things are going to be recorded. The other thing too is we want to make this process as painless as possible. I mentioned sharing information. I also would encourage that staff puts a risk ranking to some of the assets. If there's an uncertainty, is there a low, a medium, or a high risk of ARO attached to things? And we can look at, again, we would look at all the moderate and high, but if there's a low risk, for example, district buildings that don't have anything beyond a standard HVAC system, you know, there wouldn't be chemicals, there wouldn't be other things that need to be cleaned up. And if it's on owned land as opposed to leased land, there's probably not a lot of risk of an ARO. We will poke around at asbestos, definitely, in older buildings. That is going to be an item that would attract an ARO. So if you're looking at age of buildings, but the other community that I gave it as an example, redid their town hall in 2002, 2003. There's almost no asbestos in that building. So we'll be having those conversations of, you know, is this a pre-1990 building? That's kind of the magic mark for when asbestos was not used as much, or is it newer, right? Or has it been renovated so much since then that all the asbestos would be gone anyway? So those are the types of conversations we'll be having with Bev and the team.
Perfect. Do I see any other questions? Mayor Seegers?
No, I'm good.
Okay, I pulled up our financial statement and I see that it's kind of broken down into 3 sections: financial assets, liabilities, and non-financial assets. So if I'm understanding this correctly, we're going to add that section that is non-financial liabilities and really break that out and make it much more clear.
Yeah, you're going to have a new line item for asset retirement obligations as a liability, some note disclosure that explains some of the things. Again, we're going to increase the tangible capital assets. That's under the current framework. There are discussions, not within the scope of what we want to really get into today, but there are discussions around changing how those financial statements look. And it is possible that the asset retirement obligations and some of the other, what I would call long-range liabilities, or longer term liabilities would look different. You have some other, you have employee accruals, you have some other longer range things which are estimates and are not necessarily a scheduled payment like debt would be, or accounts payable. Some of that may change, and the hopes there is that the change makes more sense when you're looking at the financial statements to pull some of these things out and show them separately as, here's my accounts payable, unavoidable. Here's my long-term debt, unavoidable. I've got scheduled payments. Here's a section of estimates and things. So that's several years away, but that will also help with the understandability of the financial statements of, realistically, it should tie in a little bit better to your budget and what you're planning to spend for next fiscal year. versus things that are long range and will be estimates that are revisited every year and don't necessarily translate to real cash flows.
Perfect. I think that's all from our end. Thank you for the presentation, and thank you for being on top of this upcoming change, and as well as our finance department.
Absolutely. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for having me on today. It was a pleasure to see everybody again.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Okay, so moving along our agenda, I believe we're at adjournment. So thank you, Councillor Scott. I think we missed a couple of recommendations. So if we go back to item 5.1, page 2, there are a few recommendations. What?
Sure.
I think Councillor Scott will make them.
I'll move recommendation 2 and 3, that committee of the whole provide policy direction to council, which will form the priorities for drafting short-term rental accommodation. What's that?
We haven't actually received the report yet either.
Oh, well, let's start with that. We should probably do that before. Oh.
Okay, so I think I got a motion to move recommendations 1, 2, and 3. Do I have a seconder for that? Thank you. Okay, all in favor of recommendations 1, 2, and 3 from item 5.1? And just to finish off the procedural stuff, do I have a recommendation to receive the report of item 5.2? Moved by Mayor Seeger, seconded by Councillor Scott. All in favor? Thank you for that, Councillor Scott. One more? Let's get out of here. I see a motion to